Today is Tuesday, 19th November, and again, I must first of all apologise for the poor lighting conditions and for the very late time of this video. Also, today's video is going to be significantly shorter than some of the videos that I normally do. The reason for that is that today, Tuesday, 19th of November, we have had an absolutely packed day here in Budapest. We attended various ministries. We visited the foreign ministry. I should say, make it clear that when I say we, I mean myself and my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, the Duran, in other words, but also various other people who were also participating in this visit. So anyway, we've had a very, very tight day. We've had lots of meetings with all sorts of people. I'm going to discuss this visit in more detail when I return to London with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, not returning to London with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, but after I have returned to London, I will be discussing it with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Suffice to say that the one thing I've taken away already from this visit is that, at least in Hungary, and I'm not here talking only about officials of the government, I mean generally, there is absolute bafflement and bewilderment and growing alarm about Western policy in relation to Russia and Ukraine. And to be frank, I don't think there are many supporters of that policy in Hungary. There are plenty of people who are critical of the government, of the Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, for all sorts of reasons, though my own sense is that he continues to have a critical mass of support. But on the foreign policy, you would find very few people who would who would express any significant disagreement with him. But anyway, all of that I will discuss in more detail when I get back to London. Today, I'm going to return to the top story and focus on that story in this program. And this is the first confirmed use of ATACMS missiles against Russia. Ukraine launched ATACMS missiles against Russia last night. And importantly, the first confirmation of this came from the Russian Foreign Ministry. And this was the statement that they provided. Today at 03:25 a.m., that's 03:25 a.m. Moscow time, 19th November, the enemy launched strikes by 6 ballistic missiles targeting a facility in Bryansk region. According to confirmed data, US-made ATACMS operational tactical missiles have been used. As a result of anti-missile operation, S-400 and Pantsir systems shot down 5 missiles and damaged 1. Its fragments hit the technical territory of the military facility in Bryansk region, causing a fire that was quickly eliminated. There are no casualties or damage. Now, the words made that it was ATACMS missiles, that 5 missiles were shot down and 1 was damaged, and that there are no casualties or damage are highlighted in this statement in bold. So the Russians are informing us that there was an attack, that it took place against a facility in Bryansk region. This is not Kursk region. Claims and reports that were circulating over the last 2 days that the ATACMS strikes would be confined to Kursk region and would be principally focused or directed against the North Korean troops who are supposed to be there. Well, we already see that those claims, those reports that were circulating are untrue. The attack was launched not at Kursk region at all, not at the pocket there, nor at any part of Kursk region. It was launched against Bryansk region, which is located, as far as I'm aware, slightly to the north, and it attacked a facility there. There's no suggestions that I'm aware of that there are any North Korean troops in Bryansk region. But importantly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the Russians claim that 5 out of the 6 ATACMS missiles which were launched were shot down, and that the remaining one that was not shot down was damaged, and some debris from this missile fell and caused a fire, but that no damage or casualties were inflicted as a result of this attack. Now, no one is commenting about this. Everybody is focused, understandably enough, on the fact that we have had the first ATACMS strike against Russia. Well, I nonetheless feel it is important to state the obvious, which is that the Russians are telling us that this attack was a failure, that the missiles were launched at their target. The Russian air defense system intercepted them. 5 out of the 6 missiles that were launched were destroyed. 1 was damaged and apparently knocked off course, and no damage or casualties were caused in the facility, the actual facility that was attacked. By any definition, that was a failure. Now, I would say that, of course, this is the Russians giving us this information, but so far there has been no evidence at all to contradict their claim. And, well, no doubt we will be getting satellite photos, but the confident way in which the Russians are stating that the attack was a failure gives good reason to think that the attack did indeed fail in exactly the way that the Russians say. So, 6 expensive ATACMS missiles in relatively short supply. We've been told several times that the stockpiles of these missiles are reducing and are limited. 6 of these expensive missiles were launched at a target on Russian territory, an act of incredible, reckless, extreme provocation, one which has come in for significant criticism in the United States. I believe that Senator Tom Massey is now talking about having President Biden impeached because he has conducted an act of war against Russia without obtaining congressional authorization. And of course, he's not the only person who in the United States has criticized this action. But anyway, this reckless, extreme, provocative step was taken, and the first attack was a failure. 6 expensive missiles in short supply were lost, and apparently the attack itself, in military terms, achieved nothing. Now, this brings me back to a point I've made in program after program. Whatever else it is, the ATACMS is not a wonder weapon. We've been hearing ever since 2022 what a game-changer weapon system it would be if it was deployed in an aggressive way against the Russians in Ukraine. That proved not to be the case when it was attacking Russian facilities in Donbass and in Crimea, as I discussed in my previous video. In fact, the ATACMS has made no difference at all to the direction of the war. I'm not able myself to see that it has changed the course of the war or delayed the Russian advance, even by so much as a day. Now, I'm not definitely and conclusively saying that. Maybe some things were achieved through this launch of these ATACMS missiles, but I have seen no evidence that that was the case. So a reckless step has been made, launching missiles like this against Russia against Russian territory. Again, all sorts of misleading information and misdirection was circulated in the American media about how the attack would be confined to the Kursk pocket and would be focused on North Korean troops there, all of which has turned out to be false, and nothing has been achieved other than the loss of 6 expensive missiles. If what the Russians say is true, as I believe it is. So again, to repeat once more, the ATACMS is not a wonder weapon. It is not a game changer in this war. This affair, this episode, once again highlights its relative low efficiency in this war. Every so often, missiles get through. One series of missile strikes back in, I think it was late 2023, did get through and do a certain amount of damage at an airbase in Crimea. But overall, the effectiveness of these missiles has fallen far below expectations and has been slight. Now, it is likely, despite all this mumbling and denials and hesitations and misdirections that we're getting in the French and British media, that over the course of the next couple of days or weeks, follow-up attacks will be made with Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles supplied purportedly to Ukraine by Britain and France. Of course, the carrier fighter jets that carry these aircraft, Sukhoi 24s for the time being, though these are now in desperately short supply themselves, though it is assumed that at some point in the next few months, Mirage 2000 fighter jets will start to arrive in Ukraine and will begin to take their place. Anyway, these aircraft, if they are deployed to launch these missiles against Russian territory, they will have to come very close to the Russian border. They will be at risk of being scanned and monitored by the extremely efficient and very advanced Russian air defense system. This is a recipe for very high casualties on the part of the pilots and, of course, the fighter jets that launch these missiles. Again, to repeat one last time, an incredibly reckless, dangerous and provocative move has been made, and one which, as we have already had reason to see, is not going to change the direction of the war. Now, what makes this all so baffling and so incredibly frustrating is that this is well known in Britain, France, and the United States. Over the course of today, as I understand it, I haven't seen the exact words, but I understand that he has spoken on this issue. President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has spoken out. He has said that the ATACMS cannot make a fundamental difference to the course of the war. The problem that Ukraine has is not shortages of weapons, it is shortages of men. That what Ukraine therefore needs to do is to recruit and enlist thousands more, tens of thousands more men to fill up the gaps in its forces. In other words, 160,000 or perhaps even more Ukrainians, young Ukrainians, or perhaps even old Ukrainians, need to be drafted and sent to the meat grinder, which is the battlefront, in a country that is now facing a demographic crisis. And the tragedy and the horror of it is almost beyond imagination, but that is what Jake Sullivan and other Western officials are demanding of Ukraine. And in the meantime, they're going out of their way to provoke the Russians and to give false hope to the Ukrainians by supplying to them weapons and, importantly, by assisting them to launch those weapons which dangerous and provocative move that it is, they perfectly well know is not going to change the outcome of the war. The cynicism of this is beyond comprehension, at least by me. What it reflects, as I'm going to come into in a moment, as far as I can see, is an extraordinary level of anger and obsession on the part of Western leaders, Western leaders in some of the West European states that make up NATO, Britain and France especially, and of course on the part of the United States within the Biden administration as well. I have to say that as of this moment, it looks to me that one of the reasons why the decision was made to authorize these strikes is because the United States, or at least to be more precise, the Biden administration and its European allies have become worried that with the catastrophic news coming from the battlefronts, the situation in Ukraine is becoming increasingly desperate, the Ukrainian army is becoming increasingly demoralized, and that there is therefore a feeling that something needs to be done to encourage the Ukrainians to go on fighting and dying in this futile, pointless, already lost war. And that is one of the reasons why this decision has been made, along with the reason I have discussed already, which, by the way, has been now widely repeated in sections of the US media and, incidentally, the British and European media, in order to embarrass and make trouble for Donald Trump. Now, I am going to say that I have now rather come through to the view that there is a further factor behind this decision. One specific thing, which might more than anything else have provoked the timing. Now, over the last couple of days, there has been a G20 summit meeting in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. The Brazilians were hosting this G20 meeting. Various important leaders were there. Biden was there. China's leader, Xi Jinping, was there, though importantly, Biden and Xi did not meet, or at least not for any length of time at this meeting. They just met before at a meeting in Lima, in Peru. I've already discussed in my previous video the fact that President Xi basically threw the book at President Biden over the course of that meeting in Lima, in Peru. The meeting in Brazil, the G20 meeting, by the way, had its share of embarrassments for President Biden. It turned out that he missed the group photo, and I suspect the intense annoyance of the United States, of the US officials, of the Biden administration. The Brazilians did not delay the taking of the group photograph to enable President Biden and the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to participate in this group photo. Now, all kinds of explanations and reasons for this have been given, but I have to say it is astonishing to me that the authorities in Brazil did not wait for the President of the United States to turn up and participate in this photo. And to me, I have to say this looks a little like the Brazilians making it fairly clear that they have a less than favourable view of President Biden himself, possibly in light of this decision to launch missile strikes against Russia, which the United States has just made. President Putin, by the way, himself did not attend this meeting. Brazil is a signatory to the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, which is a product of the Rome Statute, has issued an arrest warrant against President Putin on a charge which I've already said previously I don't agree with or even fully understand. But anyway, President Putin made clear that he would not attempt to attend the G20 summit meeting, if for no other reason, because he does not want to cause embarrassment to his host and friend, President Lula of Brazil. The Russians were represented by their foreign minister, their very capable foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, just saying. Anyway, there were other somewhat embarrassing moments. President Xi of China had a meeting with Prime Minister Starmer of Britain. Prime Minister Starmer of Britain started the meeting by reading out a lecture to the Chinese president about the treatment of protesters in Hong Kong. President Xi listened to it all with a poker face, as he always does. But when it came for the two to shake hands after the meeting, well, again, it was fairly clear that though he did shake hands, President Xi was not impressed. But anyway, the point is that over the course of this meeting and in the weeks preceding it, the various officials of all the various G20 countries, the world's 20 biggest economies, supposedly, the various officials of these countries, the so-called Sherpas, would have been busy at work trying to agree the text of the final communique. Now, this text is usually prepared in advance of the meeting itself. It would be an extremely reckless and unwise thing to leave the text to the actual meeting. And to Western frustration, the language that finally appeared in the G20 statement watered down still further the position of the various powers concerning the war in Ukraine. And the best account of this is in the Financial Times. G20 waters down support for Ukraine amid pressure for peace talks with Russia. Advanced economies, that means that's a euphemism for the Western powers, amid criticism of Moscow targeting civilian infrastructure and nuclear threats in Rio statement. And then the body of the article in the Financial Times reads, the world's biggest economies have signalled weakening support for Ukraine, issuing a joint declaration that watered down previously agreed criticism of Russia's war against the country and included only a broad reference to human suffering caused by Moscow's 1,000-day invasion. The statement from the leaders of the G20 group of advanced economies, which declined for a second year to issue an outright condemnation of Moscow's invasion, came as Ukraine's President Zelensky has come under increased pressure from some Western allies to consider peace talks despite Russian troops occupying about a fifth of the country's territory. The pressure also came partly in anticipation of Donald Trump's second term. Meeting in Rio de Janeiro, the G20, which includes the leaders of critical Ukraine allies such as the US, UK, France and Germany, agreed a statement that referenced the negative impact, the added impacts of the war, and welcomed initiatives that support a comprehensive, just and durable peace. Unlike the document produced by last year's G20 summit in New Delhi, which, by the way, already watered down significantly criticism of Russia, this year's communique did not include a condemnation of Ukraine-related nuclear threats, a demand for a cessation of attacks on food and energy infrastructure, or the phrase, today's era must not be of war. All had been touted by Western powers last year as diplomatic criticisms of Moscow. The Rio document included just one paragraph devoted to the war in Ukraine, compared with 7 paragraphs in the New Delhi statement. It is not the language on Ukraine that we would have liked to see, said one senior Western diplomat from a Western G20 member. The negotiations over Ukraine and conflict in the Middle East were left until the final days before the summit, a reflection of the wide gulf between Western members of the group and states such as Russia, China, and other countries with close links to Moscow. And then the article goes on to say that, well, it goes on to quote another European diplomat as saying, the language is not strong enough. There's nothing on the latest attacks, but nobody wanted to push too far. Otherwise, it would have been a fight and there would be no statement. So there it is. The G20 met and the West was isolated. They wanted a full-throated statement condemning Russia and its attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure, and they failed to get it. And of course, President Biden would have known all about that, as would his officials, before they took the decision to authorize the missile strikes on Russia. And given what an angry person President Biden has become, I have to say that I strongly suspect that anger about this diplomatic failure will have probably played some part in pushing Biden to make the decision that he did. He's got much, in fact, over the last few months to be angry about. He was dumped by his party before the election. The election went against his vice president, Kamala Harris. Donald Trump, a man who Biden has fiercely criticized and has given every indication he dislikes, won the election. Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, for what it's worth, is telephoning Vladimir Putin, breaking the agreed policy of not contacting Putin, which must have been agreed by the Western powers with the United States, the Biden administration, probably 2 years ago. And on top of that, Biden's diplomats failed to get even a watered-down statement condemning Moscow of the level that was achieved at the G20 summit meeting in Delhi a year ago. Put all this together, bearing in mind what a cantankerous person Joe Biden is. There are numerous reports to that effect. And to be frank, I don't find it that surprising that all reflection and thinking went out of the window, that the concerns of the Department of Defense were disregarded, and the decision was taken, which we have now seen put into effect. Notice that the Pentagon up to now has avoided commenting in any detail about this affair, and I've noticed a deafening silence up to this time from the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin. So there we are. Now, none of this makes any difference to the fact that, as President Putin correctly pointed out, this attack with the ATACMS missiles could only have been launched with the active involvement of US technicians. President Putin has discussed this previously. He has explained that the targeting data, the processing of the missiles before they were launched, requires classified information and also use of technologies and expertise that the United States possesses, but which Ukraine does not. So US military personnel would have been involved in this attack on Russian territory. Now, the extraordinary fact, even as this attack was carried out, is that absolutely no one at all that I am aware of who has commented about this attack in any Western media outlet has denied this fact. There's been no attempt to pretend that an attack of this kind could have taken place without the direct participation of American military personnel. And I ought to quickly say that over the course of the many meetings I attended today here in Budapest, which I want to stress were not all of them with actual officials of the Hungarian government. Anyway, one person who I think probably does have some knowledge of this matter. Anyway, he said that in his view, Putin on this point was right. I'm not going to say more. I believe there's going to be an interview in which that will be placed on the record. But in case there is not, I'm not going to disclose or say anything further about who it was that said that. Anyway, I heard it. I was in the room when it was said, and I have no doubt at all that it is true. No one is denying it. The Russians, meantime, of course, have again homed in to this very thing. Now, we've had a statement from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and he made this whilst he was in Rio de Janeiro. He said Ukraine strikes on Bryansk region using ATACMS missiles are a sign that the West is trying to escalate the situation, as such strikes are impossible without American help. And then we have a direct quote. I'm getting this from TASS, by the way, the official Russian news agency. The fact that multiple ATACMS were used last night against the Bryansk region signals that they in the West want an escalation. You see, it is impossible to use these high-tech missiles without the Americans, and President Putin has repeatedly said this. And Lavrov then went on to say that Putin had warned Western countries how Russia's position would change if, quote, this range of weapons that we're now talking about, i.e. up to 300 kilometers, is approved. As a matter of fact, this is not about authorizing Ukraine's use of long-range missiles. This is simply about declaring that from now on, we will be striking up to 300 kilometers. So that was Lavrov, and he's reminding us, as I said, of what Putin has been saying. Now, over the course of the day, there's been much commentary in the media in the West about the fact that Putin has just approved the revisions to Russia's nuclear doctrine, lowering the threshold, allowing Russia to use, permitting Russia to use its nuclear weapons in its own defense. And inevitably, some people are linking these two facts. In my opinion, it is pure coincidence. The decision to change the doctrine was made some weeks ago. We have discussed it already extensively in the Duran. Alex Christoforou and I have done at least one video on this, and Glenn Deason and myself also discussed this change in Russian policy in a video we did with the Russian academic and advisor, high-level advisor, including to President Putin himself, Sergei Karaganov. Sergei Karaganov has been one of the main advocates of this decision to lower the nuclear thresholds. And if you go onto the Duran, you can find the video of that interview. So this was already in the pipeline and it was going to happen. But that does not mean that the Russians are not going to respond. Now, I don't know, and I'm not going to guess what the Russian response is going to be in any specific detail. But I will repeat a number of things that I've said already. Firstly, the Russians have made it clear that they reserve the right to respond wherever they choose against the Western powers, the countries that have conducted undertaken this operation. At the moment, the United States, Britain, and France, but if Germany also supplies Taurus missiles, ultimately Germany as well. And as I said, the option to do this, as far as the Russians are concerned, exists. So it is highly likely, in fact, I would say it is almost certain, in fact, one can count on it, that the Russians will now start to provide more military technology to adversaries of the United States in the Middle East, in the Korean Peninsula, North Korea, in Iran, in Africa, in all sorts of places, with the United States military spread out all across the world, with the same true to a great extent of Britain and France also. British, French, and American troops are now vulnerable to this Russian retaliation in a way that they would not have been had this decision not been made. The Russians, it is now being suggested, could retaliate in other ways. Over the last few weeks, there's been all sorts of flesh-creeping talk about the Russians being engaged in some major sabotage operations across Europe. And over the last couple of days, an important cable linking, I believe, Germany and Finland has been cut or damaged in some way. And I saw reports earlier today that the Germans and the French are now claiming that this was an act of sabotage. I'm not saying it was, I'm not saying it wasn't, I'm simply saying that I saw those reports. And, well, I'm not sure how much reality there are to all of these sabotage claims, but perhaps they do point in a certain direction. Maybe the Russians are indeed involved in some way behind these events. And, well, if so, it's highly likely, very probable, in fact, that we will see an escalation. There is one other thing, which I don't think I have spoken about before, but which does, or so it seems to me, is very likely as a result of what has just happened. Every proposal discussing possible agreements to end the war in Ukraine has included proposals for countries to provide security guarantees to Ukraine. That included, by the way, the Istanbul Agreement that was, or appeared to have, been agreed between Russia and Ukraine at the talks in Istanbul in April 2022, and which resulted in a document which both negotiating delegations initialed. Amongst the guarantor states set out in Istanbul was Russia. Russia was to guarantee Ukraine's independence, and as a guarantor, it would have had certain rights, including the right to object to the deployment, not just object, but to veto the deployment of foreign troops on Ukrainian territory, and to veto Ukrainian troops participating in military exercises with foreign troops on its own territory as well. Quite important concessions by the Ukrainians, which they made at Istanbul and which are there in the agreement, by all accounts. Now, the British, the French, and the Americans were also expected to provide Ukraine with similar guarantees. Now, I am going to make a guess that before long, the Russians are going to make it clear that they are no longer prepared to countenance any guarantees provided by these countries to Ukraine as part of any peace agreement. The Russians will say that Britain, France, and the United States, as co-belligerents in the war, in Ukraine against Russia are no longer independent parties one step removed from the war, and for that reason, they should not provide guarantees. They are, as far as the Russians are concerned, now enemy states which have committed acts of war against Russia, and Russia therefore will object to any proposal which includes these countries as potential co-guarantors of Ukraine's security as part of any peace agreement. That, I suspect, is going to make negotiating a peace agreement more difficult if that is the Russian stance. And by the way, I suspect it will be. In fact, I'm going to go further. I'm going to say that even if President Trump, rescinds this decision when he is inaugurated president in January, the Russians are unlikely to reverse their position on this and will continue to insist that in light of this action, the United States and its two allies, Britain and France, are no longer in a position to act as guarantors. In which case, none of the most important Western countries would be in a position to act as guarantors for Ukraine in the event of a peace agreement. I've already said in a recent program that recent language used by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, in which he referred to the EU as something that had evolved into a political military organization, made it unlikely, as far as I could see, that the Russians would agree, as they also did in Istanbul, that Ukraine, as part of a peace agreement, would be at liberty to seek admission into the European Union. So we are likely to see a major stiffening in Russian demands as a result of these moves. No EU entry, I think that is a real possibility. No guarantees from Britain, France, the United States, and if the Taurus missiles are supplied, Germany as well, to Ukraine either. And I'm going to say again that I think it is even more likely that that will now be the Russian position. Ukraine, if it wants to negotiate an end to the war with the Russians, is going to be left dealing with them by itself. A daunting prospect for any Ukrainian official, and one which I have to say, if we ever reach that point, which I am confident eventually we will, well, if we ever do reach that point, a daunting prospect for any Ukrainian official, and one which will make Ukraine even more dependent on Russia than it would otherwise have been. In that respect, this American move has played directly into the hands of the Russian hardliners. So there we are. That is the net effect of this extraordinary decision. Nothing useful for Ukraine is going to be achieved by this move. There's been criticism of it within the United States itself. President Trump's supporters in Congress and outside are very angry, even though, wisely, in my opinion, President Trump is preserving a stony silence. And Ukraine's diplomatic room for maneuver has been further reduced, and all to achieve what? To launch missiles against Russia, which as I have said previously, even the Americans themselves agree, are not going to change or significantly improve Ukraine's position in the war. It is one of the most incomprehensible, or at least not incomprehensible, but most unwise decisions. I can think of much stronger words. Unwise and eccentric decisions in international affairs that I have ever seen. But there we are. That is what we have. Now, even as all of this is going on, the war itself continues. I have not been discussing the war in any great detail in any programs recently. And to be honest, whilst I'm in Budapest, doing so is going to be very difficult. And I'm not going to try to do that in this program. Suffice to say that the last 24 hours appear to have witnessed a further significant deterioration in Ukraine's overall position. There are reports that Novaya Ilinka, north of the Kurakovo reservoir, has been captured, that the Russians are advancing into Selidovo, into Kurakovo, I meant Kurakovo, from the north across the river. It seems across the reservoir, it seems the bridge across the reservoir is intact, which seems extraordinary. It looks as if the Ukrainian troops in Kurakovo are in effect now surrounded on all sides. The Russians today announced that the village of Novoselidivko has been captured, and all of the indications suggest that the Russians are very close now to being in a position where they feel they can launch their attack on Pokrovsk itself. Probably they will wait until Kurakovo is under their control. But as I said, we're coming very close to that point already. The consistent pattern in this war is that every so often the West supplies Ukraine with some supposed wonder weapon or miracle weapon. There is a brief burst of excitement. We had this when the M777s, the howitzers, were supplied to Ukraine. I don't know whether people remember that. That was in the early summer of 2022. Then we had it again when the HIMARS missiles were supplied to Ukraine. Then we had it over the course of the winter of 2022-2023, when, again, going against their own red lines, the Western powers started to supply Ukraine with tanks and armoured vehicles, all of which have abjectly failed. The former British military officer, Colonel Hamish de Breton Gordon, recently claimed that the Challenger 2s that had been sent to Ukraine had been a spectacular success. I think he's practically alone in believing that. That's all I'm going to say about that. Anyway, then, of course, we've had other weapons supplied to Ukraine. The ATACMS the Storm Shadows and the ATACMS were supplied to Ukraine. The small diameter bombs were supplied to Ukraine. The cluster munitions were supplied to Ukraine. And the F-16s and the other fighter jets were supplied to Ukraine. And nothing has changed. The situation has deteriorated. The Patriots, the Iris-Ts, the NASAMS, they've all been supplied to Ukraine. And as I said, all of these weapons shipped to Ukraine at prodigious cost, depleting Western arsenals, have achieved, well, I won't say nothing. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has said that they have prolonged the war, which indisputably is true, but suffice to say, they have not led to the defeat of the Russians or produced victory. And they cannot do so And the same will happen with the ATACMS and any other missiles that the West allows or green lights strikes on Russia with. They will not change the outcome of the war. So the euphoria over this decision we're seeing in some sections of the media and perhaps in Ukraine itself is certain to abate, and the Russians will keep grinding on westwards. Grinding on, by the way, at ever more rapid speeds. And I've discussed the situation in Kurachovo and near Pakrovsk. I'm not yet familiar with what's going on in Zaporozhye region, where the Russians appear to be also preparing some kind of advance, specifically focusing on the fortified village of Velika Novosilka. But I have seen a whole cluster of reports appearing in various Russian telegram channels over the last couple of hours, all of which say that there has been a major collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Chasiv Yar, that the Russians have now reached the industrial district at the very center of Chasiv Yar, that they're in the process of capturing certain factories inside this industrial district. The industrial district is the last major fortress area left in Chasiv Yar. So it looks as if that important strategic town is about to fall. So, to repeat again, a reckless, irresponsible decision made despite Donald Trump and perhaps, in fact, I'm sure definitely made largely in anger, and it's not going to achieve anything except put Ukraine in an even worse position, ultimately, than it was in already. All I will say is that decisions made in anger are repented at leisure, and that, I'm confident, is what we're going to see. Well, as I said, this is going to be a shorter video. Apologies for the late hour of its publication. This is where today's video ends. I'll be coming back tomorrow. I'll be discussing, by the way, President Zelensky's extraordinary further comments. I'm also, since I've come to Hungary, gained more insight into his thinking, which, by the way, reinforces my belief that President Zelensky has no intention of ever negotiating with the Russians, and it is wishful thinking to think that either he or his officials do. But that, as I said, is a topic for another day. This is where today's program ends. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.